Well, the time I first felt like there was a true mystery of Easter Island that I had not been involved in was in the very spring of 1980. Karen and I had been down here. I was on sabbatical, and we had been asked to help to excavate and reconstruct Ahutautira, which is just down here. And in the after that work was over, I was involved in the logistics of being able to sit down at the museum and write some of these things up. And so I was there, and I don't know if it were January or February, might have been even later, but it was a kind of a spring day, a lot like what today is about, where the air is heavy, and it's heavy with moisture, but it was warm. And it was around 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening when we would normally quit, and I began walking back along the strip to High, and the air was different. It was somehow leaden. It was very still, and so I'm walking along, and I thought there's something really funny about today. And you know, you can't walk underneath the gaze of those impressive statues without sometimes feeling very small indeed. And I didn't know what was going on, but there was something else going on. You could feel it in the air. And so I just said, okay, that's fine. And I saw that out to sea, there was a single boat trudging along. And I don't know how boats trudge, but that's essentially what it was trying to do, was trudge along. And it was slow. And so I kept walking, and I just was sort of half noticing this boat that was out to sea. It was a fisherman's boat, and it was manned by a guy by the name of Calderon. And he was a guy who had a great gap in his front teeth, where a tooth had been knocked out in some fight or something to that effect. And he was a husky man. He had broad shoulders. How do I know this? Because he was headed for the Caleta at, the Caleta is the Caleta. I mean, it's where everybody pulls up at the wharf and disgorges whatever fish they've got. And in those days, we had a fishing station there that measured the fish and who weighed them to know exactly what was coming in. And it was probably put up by the Chileans, I suppose. But the important thing is that today, none of that exists. It's not even there anymore. So I noticed something else as I'm walking along, and I start walking in front of the fishermen's houses, some of which are still there. And there are various people who are associated with those, some of whom I knew. And so I went down to the wharf, and there were people coming in from every direction down to the wharf. And I have no idea, because we did not have walkie-talkies in those days, and we didn't have any other way of signaling people who were on shore by the people offshore. Well, so Calderon brings his boat around to where I guess I call them the ribs. They're actually roundish pieces of wood that were used as a skid for bringing in boats. And it was something that everybody helped with. There wasn't anybody who was left out. And so I stood there wondering what the heck all of this is about. And there were women present. There were ladies who were down there at the wharf who were excited, and I don't know how they knew. To this day, I do not know how they knew something big was going to happen. I didn't know. And so I waited around down there, and then Calderon brings his boat in, tips it onto some of these rib-like pieces of wood, and then every man who was available jumped to the side of the boat, one side or the other, and began hauling. And that's when I noticed the fish. It was as long as his boat. It was entirely inside his boat. It was some kind of, it wasn't a swordfish, but it was sort of like a, I can't remember at the moment what they called it, but it was a, uh, a tuna with a long snout. It was about that long. And the whole fish was in his boat, and he was riding on the front head of it. And so the men all, as teamwork, as though they'd been doing this for hundreds of years before, grabbed the gunnels of the boat and hauled this thing in. Wow, well, that was a real catch. You can see that. And they wanted to take it out of the boat. And so Calderon stood aside, and all of the 18 men rolled this boat over so that the fish fell out. And so once that happened, they all grabbed a hold of whatever they could of the fish and tried to haul it in. Well, there was a funny part of all of this thing, because they may have hauled the boat in backwards rather than forwards. And they, the fish was oriented the wrong way, because if you try and haul that fish up onto the bank of the I don't know what you call it, it's not a bay, but on the bank anyway, the scales were all in the opposite direction, and they couldn't get the fish to do it. And so they had to turn the fish around and then haul it in so it slid preferably on its own scales. So they hauled it all the way in, and then they had a great knife that Calderon wielded, and he cut this fish into pieces. And the pieces at first were about 4 feet long, and there were at least 3 of them, and maybe a half. So you're talking about a fish that's maybe 12 feet long. It's a big one. And so then they very carefully lifted it up. Not it, they lifted the pieces up, and they took them in to be weighed, which they put in a great saucer-shaped device that had chains on it so that they could hold it up. And they weighed each of the pieces, and of course there was a lot of fervor around, and I remember the women saying everyone in Hangaroa is going to eat tuna tonight. And she was probably right, because they had no way of being able to preserve it. And not only that, but the women would hover over this fish and the men with the great knives who were slashing away and cutting it up into pieces, and they were just all very thrilled, and in an odd way they seemed turned on by all this. And I just don't view fish that way, but other people do. So I then got to thinking, how the hell did Calderon get this fish into his boat? Now, I had heard several versions of how they did that kind of thing with a fish too big for the boat. And one of the versions that I heard was that they sink the boat and then bail like hell. They sink the boat, slide the fish in, then bail water out of the boat, which gradually would raise it, but it would also take more or less forever to do that. Calderon was the only man in that boat, and he was a muscular guy, there's no doubt about it. But I asked him later, and I did so, how did you get this fish in the boat? And he grinned at me with his great gap in his teeth, and he said, "Mana." Oh, okay, magic. Well, it's not magic to them. It's a combination of talent and magic, if you will, and luck, and a whole batch of other things that the islanders themselves alone know. And so he was happy with that answer, and he walked away. And that, to me, was the great mystery of Easter Island. How do you get a fish that weighs 1,000 pounds into a boat that has only one man and the boat is only maybe 12 feet long at max. And you do this somehow without turning over the boat, without losing the one man who can move this boat along. And how does the fish not flop its way into your disaster? And I thought, and forever afterwards, that was the mystery of Easter Island. Raising a multi-ton statue, pancake, not a problem, compared to getting a live fish 10 feet, if not longer than that, live into the boat and getting it to calm down. There was no harpoon marks on the thing. He didn't have a harpoon. He just caught it on a hand line. I'm impressed with that. But then, I'm from Wyoming and I'm easily impressed.